I got an email the other day from a woman who was asking my advice. Now, I don't get many emails from women asking my advice about many things, but the Irish language seems to be one thing that people get in touch with me about. And I've become kind of an agony aunt, I think, for Irish language writing and Irish language learning problems. So I had to look this one up. That's a Coirlor Cree Chroite, as Gaeilge. Coirlor Cree Chroite. I had to use folklore.ie because I should have learned. So it's Coirlor Cree Chroite, me. TheGhine atá ag lura cóire mí ar chun scuige scríb, chun scuige leirtas, chun scuige eil. Agus chuoin ban se I dagháilm tuair mé Emily agus thug si dúchlandm. Dúirt si nach raibh si trééis bheith ag fálam bheith le fiche bliain. So she hadn't been learning Irish in 20 years, and she gave me a challenge of asking me to recommend to her what she should listen to, not what she should read, not what she should watch, but what she should listen to. And it got me thinking about the huge changes that have happened in Irish language radio broadcasting since I started out in Radio na Lithe years ago. So vi chlár gomsa Radio na Lithe na blianta hin, beidir fihe blian hin, no gur hosig mé amach agus vi me anna hanja was agus vi sé go húntaach agus vi dine ag éistecht ar leid vi ma heilig ag éistecht timppel im nach lia ach inis le Podchraoltaí agus in Italy tá gach stáisiún radio trééis dul go hidirnáisiúnta agus tá daine ag éistecht leis na rudí atá a chréile agus iad dul timppel ar goáin suglúiste ar own fóca. So people are now listening, of course, to lots more podcasts, and it's a wonderful way of consuming what we would traditionally have called radio content back in the day when I started out 20 years ago in Radio na Lithe, and you were kind of limited geographically. You'd be fighting over the frequency within a region around Dublin in Radio na Lithe's case, and you're kind of limited from that point of view. But now, of course, first with internet broadcasting, and now with the popularity of podcasts, there's a global audience for all these different niches, these different verticals, as our American friends might call them. And the Irish language is no exception. So Emily, let's call her that, she got in touch and she asked for my advice on what to listen to, because now the challenge has gone the other way. It's actually overwhelming, the amount of Irish language content that's available. So it got me thinking about, what would I recommend to someone who is new to listening to Irish, or maybe whose only experience of listening to Irish has been through Radio na Gaeltachta up to now. And Radio na Gaeltachta, of course, do wonderful programs and wonderful podcast versions of those programs. So I definitely recommend those, and I'll come to that in a minute. But there's one particular podcast that I recommend to Emily that I wanted to mention, and that's the Bio Eregan podcast, and that's written and produced by Siúni Gwyn, Sinead Ulichoin, and Anna Breslein on RTE Radio Ahain, and it's available on the RTE.ie website, on the RTE.ie website. It's actually one of the most listened to podcasts on all of that website in combined Irish and English. So it's a really popular podcast, and it's carved out a niche, it seems, particularly among Irish speaking women. And it's an amazing program because it's so different from everything else that's out there. And I love listening to it because it's actually great fun to tune into these conversations which go in every direction that are on this show. And I'd really recommend that as a starting point for anyone who's kind of used to listening to traditional radio, Irish language radio broadcasting, and traditional formats even of shows like the ones I used to do in Radio na Lithe. It's really fresh, and it's really quite clever the way they tackle subjects from left field. So I'd really recommend that Bio Eregan podcast. That's available on Cívig RTE. Agus ein rud a Liom seo tá si tuchaidir ar léir le Google topic, le cuardach Google topic. Agus tá si scape ar fud an idirlín, an dúlan a bhuiine lá. So these are all spread out over the internet, but you'll find them with a quick Google. And the other one I wanted to mention as well, though, is the Stad Air show and podcast, which is on 2FM now, and that's by Blana Tracy. And that, again, is a really innovative format because it actually breaks the taboo of mixing Irish and English in the same show. So we're all very familiar with Micheál Hertig's way of commentating in GA, where he'd switch seamlessly from Irish to English. And, this show reminds me of that a bit. That's, in a lot of ways, that's how we actually speak Irish. Sin mar a leabhar mí beag, a bhí me gahrú siras an ír in a beirdig scaige and tam ar fad brath cétá éisiad na cétá timpeall. So this show is like that, but it's actually aimed at a very specific audience, which is young people who are studying for their Leaving Cert Irish exam. But that doesn't mean it's boring, and that doesn't mean it feels educational. It's actually quite an innovative format again. It breaks away from any kind of traditional radio formats. It's kind of a really interesting mix of guests and a lot of music that I gather is very popular these days. It wouldn't always be my cup of tea, but I'm not as young as I used to be. So I'm ceol go maith deirte lum ach tá an chlár féin ar house. So I'd really recommend that one called Stad Air, even if you're not studying for your Leaving Cert. But if you are going back to learning Irish after a gap, maybe of 20 years, or if you've recently started studying to become a primary school teacher, or if you just are learning the language from scratch, it's actually a really useful one because they translate back and forth and switch back and forth between Irish and English the whole time. And it's a really engaging format as well. But there's great stuff happening on Radio na Gaeltachta as well, and there always has been. But what's great now is the way they're packaging it up in really, what we'd call snackable content format. So, lagan chi garad and a chlorach and more a fada. So, curl machara fachna. Facto drisco chlór láthair dar bhean an tús áite Radio na Gaeltachta agus chlór úntacha sin le másca an mór míltnach a lán rudí maithe agus maran sé hart a ruúdach léignú mar sin. Ach an rud atá raibh fin Steve idirlí ná go bhfuil an chlór roinnta sús ina chudan na beaga. So sé léims timpeall is the chlór agus éisteach leis na míranna gur maiid atsa beidir míall ar sport nó míall ar políocht. Na péirs go spéise go ann sé léim timpeall agus fechant ar an mír sin. So ní gádat éisteach le chlór ag anmhí le ar láfhíle is sé a dulchuig an cartlan ag Radio na Gaeltachta agus éisteach lo. Agus tá sé go húntaach mar áis. Agus an bhfuil is bralam faoi sin the Queen I found. The thing I love in particular about listening to Tuasaita and recommending Tuasaita to people who are learning Irish is you'll be familiar with a lot of the topics because it's very much covering the news of the day or what people are talking about. So you be familiar with the topic. So even if you don't understand the Irish terminology or all of the Irish terminology, you'll understand most of it. You'll get the gist of most of it. And then you can start to figure out what the Irish for other words is by filling in the gaps a bit. And, I love the way with Tuasaita in particular, you can kind of jump around to the particular segment that you're interested in. So there are a few shows, and they're all kind of happening in the RT family, which is wonderful. But there are other exciting things happening elsewhere. And one particular show that I like a lot is Blas na Cathrach on Radio na Litha by Joe Branach. So sin Blas na Cathrach Radio na Litha. Schussing me féin amach bhí mar luig me ag créile I Radio na Litha fadó. Bhí chlór go me cúine dríochta na hólíochta a bhanan dó fadó na éisteachta an a bheogar fádach. If me tanne as a dhéanamh. Agus tá chlórúntaach ag Joe sin a bhína mar Podchraoltaí freshen. So Joe's show is great, particular Dublin focus, which is great for those of us living here, but it touches on wider subjects which make it relevant for everyone. And also it's important to remember, of course, that when we're learning Irish, for a lot of people actually listening to the so-called Dublin dialect that I speak and coming to Liom Nachlia, which I began in these Esti it's a little bit easier to understand for some people. So that it has that going for it as well. So that's all I'll say in favour of Dublin this particular video. Block Deal. Then the last one I just want to mention is one I've been interviewed on a couple of times myself, which is Splounk. This is by Kuan Ó Fearr on news talk. And yeah, the scheduling doesn't do this show any favors, unfortunately. It's kind of one of those that, you're not going to catch by chance on the radio that often. But the podcast is just a fantastic resource, and they've got all their search engine optimization right. So if you Google Splunk podcast, it will come up very prominently in the Google search results. And it's a really interesting show, really good mix of people, really great energy to it. And again, it's more of a traditional magazine format, so that would differentiate it from Bio or Egan. But in many ways, that makes it more accessible because you kind of know what's coming up, and you can fill in the gaps yourself. So there. Some of the shows, some of the podcasts that I listen to, and of course, they're actually all coming from radio stations. But these days, we're all consuming radio content in different ways, and no matter what language you're speaking, podcasts are on the rise, and actually, traditional radio listening is declining because we're not driving around as much these days to and from work. So actually, the commute has cut down on a lot of the actual incidental kind of listening to radio in the car. So that's where these podcasts are going from strength to strength. And Podchraoltaí seo ar aus ar fad agus bevralam clutch Deutsche fui Cadina Keen Ganesh and Tussalo. So this isn't an exhaustive list. This is just kind of a pick and mix selection of some of the ones that I think are great starting points for people who want to get into listening a bit more to Irish, maybe after a gap of a few years. But even for people who are kind of looking for new content in Irish, hopefully there's a couple of things there that you mightn't have come across before. But I'd love to hear from you about what you listen to. So if you send me a quick email or comment on this video wherever you're watching it, that'd be great. And please do subscribe to this YouTube channel. I feel a bit silly asking for that because it's kind of like every YouTube video has that, but apparently I've learned recently that the algorithm in YouTube really loves it when people subscribe. So it shows your content to more people when people do subscribe. So thanks a million to everyone who subscribed recently. I had over 100 new subscribers just the other day after one of my emails, which is just wonderful to see. So I'm really very grateful for that. And if you did have a minute just to click on the subscribe button, wherever it is, I'm not sure where it's going to appear on this screen. Might even be here, who knows, or here. So if you do have a minute to click on the subscribe button, that'll be brilliant. And leave a comment or send me a quick email to let me know what podcast you listen to. Okay, Gurmíle Mágat, slán.